The wind came first, a low moan across the plains that promised a fury the land knew too well. It was a Wyoming dusk in late autumn. The sky bruised a violent purple over the skeletal peaks of the Bighorn Mountains. The sun had bled out on the horizon, leaving behind a cold, gray light that offered no warmth, only the sharp truth of the coming dark. The prairie grass, brittle and bleached by a long, dry summer, bent low as if in prayer, whispering secrets of survival to the unforgiving soil. A storm was gathering its breath in the west, a great, dark beast of cloud and ice, and the air held the metallic tang of snow. Along a rutted wagon road that cut a lonely scar through the emptiness, a woman stumbled. Her name was Clara. Though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in so long, it felt like it belonged to someone else. A ghost from a life lived before this one. Her feet, bare and bloodied, found every sharp stone and thorny burr in the dirt. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, a paralytic chill that made her movements clumsy and slow. Her dress, a simple calico of faded blue, was torn at the shoulder, the thin fabric offering no defense against the wind's teeth. A dark line of dried blood traced from a split in her lower lip down to her chin, a stark map of recent violence. In her right hand, she clutched a small, silver locket, its surface dulled by time and grime. It was the only thing she had left of the world before. The metal was cold against her skin, but inside it, she knew, was a memory of warmth. A tiny, faded portrait of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her first husband, a good man, swallowed by a collapsed mine shaft 3 years ago, leaving her a widow with nothing but a good name that soon proved to be worth less than the dirt under her fingernails. Every gust of wind was a slap, and with it came the memories she was running from. Not of the mine, not of the quiet grief that followed, but of the man who came after. The heavy thump of his boots on the floorboards of their small, suffocating house. The sour smell of whiskey on his breath. A smell that always preceded the storm in his eyes. The way his voice, thick with drink and rage, could curdle the air until she could not breathe. She had endured it, told herself it was a woman's lot to endure, that a widow with no prospects had no other choice. But last night, something had broken. Not a bone, not this time, but something deeper. A final strand of hope, maybe. When he had raised his hand again, she had not cowered. She had run, out the door, into the night, with nothing but the dress on her back and the locket pressed into her palm. She saw the barn ahead, a sagging shape against the darkening sky. It was abandoned, its roof caved in on one side like a man with a broken jaw. It was shelter, nothing more. Pushing against the groaning weight of the door, she slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of old hay turning back to earth. Dust motes danced in the slivers of dying light that pierced the rotten planks. She collapsed onto a pile of damp straw in a corner, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small, invisible. The trembling started in her hands and spread through her whole body, a violent, uncontrollable shudder that was born of more than just the cold. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images came anyway. A shattered plate, a guttural curse, the look of ownership in his eyes, as if she were no different than the cattle he bought and sold. She had ceased being Clara. She had become his property, his punching bag, his shame. 20 miles east, in the small, wind-whipped town of Jericho, the lights of the general store cast a warm, yellow rectangle onto the dusty main street. Inside, the air was warmer, smelling of coffee, cured leather, and gossip. The talk, like the wind outside, was sharp and restless. Heard Jebediah's wife lit out on him last night. Silas Croft, the store's proprietor, said as he weighed out a sack of flour. He was a man whose body had gone soft, but whose eyes remained hard and calculating. Martha Gable, a rancher's wife with a face pinched by judgment, sniffed disdainfully. Lit out or was run out? I never did trust that one. Too quiet. The quiet ones are always coiled up inside, ready to strike. Jebediah was in here this morning, buying whiskey before the sun was even properly up, added another man leaning on the counter. Said she stole a silver locket from his mother's things before she ran. Called her a thief on top of everything else. Crazy is what she is, Martha declared, her voice carrying the weight of a final verdict. Running off into the wilderness with a storm coming on. She'll die out there, and it'll serve her right for abandoning her husband. A woman's place is in the home. She's a burden, that's the truth of it, Silas concluded, tying off the flour sack with a decisive tug. Always was. A man takes on a widow, he takes on another man's troubles. Jebediah was a fool to think otherwise. The bell above the door chimed, and the conversation fell quiet as a man stepped inside. Eli Hartman closed the door behind him, bringing a gust of cold air and the scent of pine and horse with him. He was not a tall man, but broad in the shoulders, with a stillness about him that seemed to take up more space than his physical frame. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind into a mask of grim endurance. A scar, old and white, cut a jagged path from his left temple down into the corner of his beard-stubbled jaw. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in the room without expression, lingering on no one. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, like a bear that had learned the hard way that the world was full of traps. He nodded once, a curt, all-encompassing greeting, and placed a short list on the counter. Silas's friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a brisk professionalism. Eli Hartman was not a man for idle chatter. He lived alone on a ranch nestled deep in the foothills, a place he'd worked by himself since his wife, Sarah, had died 5 years before. He came to town only when necessity demanded it, conducted his business in few words, and left. The townsfolk knew his story, or parts of it. They knew his wife had died in childbirth, along with the baby. They knew that after the funeral, a wall had gone up around Eli Hartman, and no one had found a way through it since. They watched him now, their gossip momentarily forgotten, replaced by a wary respect for a man so thoroughly consumed by his own solitude. As Silas gathered the items, flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, Eli stood by the cold stove, his gaze distant. He heard their words replay in his mind. Crazy. Trouble. A man's burden. He had heard such talk before. Whispers that clung to women like burrs. Labels slapped on by men who measured a woman's worth by her obedience. He thought nothing of it. It was not his concern. The world was full of troubled people and broken things. And he had learned long ago that the surest path to peace was to mind the fences of your own land and let the rest of the world burn if it wished. With his supplies packed in 2 heavy canvas sacks, he paid in coin, his movements economical. He offered another curt nod and turned to leave. Storm's turning to snow. Eli, Silas called after him. Best be careful on the ride back. Eli didn't turn. He simply raised a hand in acknowledgement before stepping back out into the biting wind, leaving the warmth and the whispers of the town behind. The ride home was a battle. The wind howled, driving pellets of sleet that stung his exposed cheeks. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, lowered its head and pushed onward, trusting the hand of its master. Eli pulled his hat down low and hunched his shoulders, his world shrinking to the trail ahead and the growing darkness around him. The plains had vanished, swallowed by the swirling gray curtain of the storm. This was his world now. The wind, the cold, the familiar weight of being utterly alone. He was almost to his property line when Gideon suddenly shied, snorting and tossing its head. Eli pulled back on the reins, his eyes scanning the gloom. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar shape of his own fence, the wooden posts like skeletal sentinels in the falling snow. Then he saw it, a dark heap crumpled at the base of a post, a splash of faded blue against the whitening ground. His first thought was that it was a dead animal, a coyote or a deer caught in the open. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the thin layer of fresh snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman. Her dark hair was fanned out around her head, already collecting snowflakes. Her face was turned to the side, pale as alabaster in the gloaming. She was unnervingly still. He knelt, his knee cracking in the cold. It was the runaway woman. It had to be. He could see the torn dress, the bare feet now blue with cold. Her lips were parted, and a faint, ragged breath ghosted from them. She was alive, barely. Eli stood up and took a step back, a cold fist clenched in his gut, a feeling entirely separate from the weather. Trouble. The word from the general store echoed in his mind. This was the world's trouble, washed up on his doorstep. He had enough ghosts in his cabin. He did not need to invite a living one in. He should ride on. Get the sheriff in the morning. It was the sensible thing to do. The safe thing. He thought of his cabin, of the stone fireplace and the bed where his wife had. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the memory. That cabin had been a place of love, then a tomb of grief. For 5 years, it had been a place of silence, his silence. To bring this woman there felt like a violation, a desecration of the quiet, orderly sorrow he had built for himself. It was his penance, his peace. He looked down at her again. Her hand was curled into a fist, and even in her unconscious state, it was clenched tight around something. One of her eyelids fluttered, a sound, no louder than the rustle of a dry leaf, escaped her lips. It was not a word, just a sound of pure, unadorned misery, a soft, broken plea to a world that had clearly stopped listening to her long ago. It was that sound that stopped him. It cut through the wall he had built around his heart, finding a crack he didn't know was there. It was the sound of a creature cornered, of a life being stripped down to its last. Flickering ember. He had heard a sound like it once before, in the last moments of his wife's labor, and the memory struck him with the force of a physical blow. He cursed under his breath, a harsh, bitter sound stolen by the wind. He could not leave her. He knew it with a grim certainty that settled in his soul like a stone. To leave her here would be to commit a kind of murder, and whatever else he was not that. With a groan of resignation, he bent down. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than she looked, a fragile bundle of bones and cold skin. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and the small, silver locket slipped from her grasp, dangling from its chain. It swung against his hand, icy cold. He carried her to Gideon, who stood patiently, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Mounting with her in his arms was an awkward, difficult process, but he managed it, settling her across his lap. He wrapped his coat around her as best he could and urged the horse forward into the swirling snow, toward the faint, distant promise of a light in his window. The cabin was small, built of sturdy pine logs chinked with mud and stone. It consisted of a single room, dominated by a large fieldstone fireplace where embers still glowed faintly. Eli carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and the world went quiet save for the howl of the wind around the eaves. He laid her down gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth, her body limp and unresponsive. For a long moment, he just stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, looking down at the woman who had just breached the walls of his solitude. Then, he moved. Years of living alone had made his actions efficient and stripped of all hesitation. He stoked the embers, adding kindling and then larger logs until a proper fire was roaring, its light pushing back the shadows and filling the small space with a dancing, golden warmth. He fetched a basin of water and a clean rag from a washstand in the corner. Kneeling beside her, he began to tend to her wounds. He was not a gentleman by nature, but his hands were steady and surprisingly careful as he dabbed at the split on her lip, cleaning away the dried blood. Her skin was icy to the touch. He saw the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, partially hidden by her damp hair. He saw the scratches on her arms and the raw, blistered soles of her feet. Each injury was a silent testament to a story he did not want to know but could easily guess. He worked in silence, his jaw tight. When he was done cleaning her wounds, he rose and went to a wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He pulled out a thick wool blanket and a long flannel nightshirt that had belonged to Sarah. He paused, the soft fabric in his hands, the faint scent of dried lavender and 5 years of disuse rising from it. A wave of grief, sharp and familiar, washed over him. He set his jaw and pushed it down. There was no time for that now. He draped the blanket over Clara, deciding against trying to change her out of her wet clothes. It felt like a line he should not cross. He would let the fire's warmth do its work. With nothing left to do for her, he retreated to the far side of the room and began the ritual of putting away his supplies. His movements slow and methodical, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. The firelight played across her sleeping face, softening the harsh lines of pain and fear. In repose, she looked younger than he had first thought. Her face was thin, but the bones were fine, delicate. A stray lock of dark hair had fallen across her forehead, and he felt a strange, unwelcome urge to brush it away. He stopped, a tin of coffee in his hand, and just watched her. Suspicion and compassion churned inside him, mixing like old whiskey and blood. The townspeople called her trouble. His own instincts screamed at him that this was a mistake. She was a stray, and strays brought disease or chaos, or attachments that ended in pain. He knew about attachments that ended in pain. He was an expert. But as he looked at the raw, chafed skin on her feet and the dark shadow of the bruise on her cheek, the compassion won out. This was not some scheming troublemaker. This was a human being who had been pushed to the very edge of her endurance. She was not trouble. She was troubled, and for reasons he could not articulate. That distinction mattered. He finished his work and sat down in his worn wooden chair by the table, a cup of coffee steaming between his hands. He did not drink it. He just sat, listening to the two sounds that now filled his cabin, the crackle of the fire and the soft, shallow breaths of the sleeping woman. Outside, the wind shrieked like a banshee. The snow was falling thick and fast now, a blinding white curtain that was burying the world. He heard the distant, lonely cry of a coyote, a sound of wild, desolate hunger. The snow would pile up against the door, trapping them, sealing them in together. For tonight, and maybe for days to come, the world would consist of only the two of them, two strangers bound by a storm, each haunted by ghosts the other could not see. He looked at her again, a flicker of something he could not name stirring in the cold, quiet ashes of his heart. Then he looked away, into the fire, and waited for the dawn. Clara woke to a world of white and gray. A pale, diffused light filtered through a single small window, illuminating a ceiling of rough-hewn logs. For a moment, she knew nothing but the unfamiliarity of the room and a deep, aching cold in her bones that felt ancient. Then memory returned, not as a gentle stream, but as a flood. The running, the frozen road, the collapsing darkness. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic. She was lying on a soft bearskin rug in front of a stone fireplace where a low fire crackled, spitting embers. A heavy wool blanket covered her. Across the room, shrouded in the morning shadows, a man sat in a wooden chair, watching her. It was the man from the storm, her rescuer. A raw fear, instinctual and sharp, seized her. Men were a source of pain, a trap she had just escaped. She tried to sit up, a gasp catching in her throat as every muscle protested. The movement was clumsy, weak. The man did not move. He simply watched, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was a silhouette of stillness, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the chair. "Easy now," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It was not an unkind sound, but it held no comfort, either. It was merely a statement of fact. He rose slowly, deliberately, as if not to spook a wild animal. He was not as tall as her second husband, but he was built of denser stuff, a man made of wood and rock and silence. He moved to the hearth where a pot simmered over the fire, and the smell of stew, venison and root vegetables filled the small cabin. Clara realized she was ravenously hungry, a hunger so deep it was a pain all its own. He ladled some of the stew into a tin bowl, his movements economical and sure. He placed it on the floor, a few feet from where she lay, alongside a cup of water and a piece of hard bread. Then he retreated to his chair, leaving a wide gulf of space between them. He did not press. He did not command her to eat. He simply offered, and then he waited. The gesture was so contrary to her experience that it left her disoriented. Jebediah would have thrown the food at her, cursing her for being a useless mouth to feed. This man, he gave her space. He gave her quiet. Her eyes darted around the cabin. It was a Spartan place, clean but lived in. A simple cot stood against one wall, its blanket neatly folded. A table with 2 chairs, a washstand, and shelves holding tins and sacks of provisions lined the other walls. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. It was a man's home, built for solitude and survival, not comfort. There was nothing of a woman's touch to be found. No curtains on the window, no braided rug on the floor beyond the one she lay upon. Hesitantly, she reached for the bowl. Her hands trembled so badly that the tin cup rattled against the floor. She ate with the desperate haste of a starving creature, not tasting the food so much as absorbing it. She kept her eyes down, acutely aware of him watching her. The silence in the room was immense, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of her own ragged breathing. When she was finished, she placed the empty bowl back on the floor, her gaze still averted. "There's more, if you want it," he said from his corner. She shook her head, finding her voice for the first time. It came out as a dry, cracked whisper. "Thank you." He gave a curt nod, and so began their strange, silent life together, dictated by the storm that had sealed them in. The snow fell for 3 days. The world outside the window was a swirling vortex of white, erasing the landscape, erasing the road to town, erasing any possibility of escape. They existed in the small bubble of the cabin, 2 solitary planets forced into a shared orbit. Their exchanges were clipped and awkward, born of necessity. "The wood box is low. I will fetch more. The water bucket is near empty." "I see it." Clara spent most of her time by the fire, regaining her strength. Her fear of him slowly receded, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started to notice things about him. She noticed his hands. They were the hands of a man who fought the land for a living, scarred, calloused, the knuckles thick and bruised. But she watched him mend a piece of leather harness one afternoon, his large, rough fingers surprisingly deft with the awl and thread. She saw him stoke the fire, his movements careful as he placed each log just so, his touch gentle. They were not the hands of her second husband, which were either clumsy with drink or clenched into fists. Eli, in turn, noticed things about her. He noticed how she flinched at any sudden noise, the scrape of a chair, a log falling in the fire, the howl of the wind. Her body would go rigid, her eyes wide and hunted. He noticed she never let her back face the door, always positioning herself in a corner, as if to guard against an attack from behind. She spoke only when spoken to, her voice barely above a whisper, her answers short and clipped. She was like a bird with a broken wing, terrified that any move might bring the hawk swooping down again. On the 4th day, the snow stopped. The sun emerged, brilliant and blinding, casting the world in a pristine, glittering white. The silence that followed the storm was profound. Clara felt a restlessness stir within her. She could not simply sit here, a useless burden on this silent man. She had to earn her keep. She began with small things. While he was outside shoveling a path to the barn, she swept the cabin floor with a worn broom. She straightened the blankets on his cot, her hands hesitating for a moment as she touched the place where he slept. She washed their few dishes and stacked them neatly. They were small acts, but they were an attempt to reclaim some piece of herself, some sense of purpose. He returned, stomping snow from his boots, and stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in her work. He said nothing. He did not thank her, nor did he tell her to stop. He simply accepted it. Another silent transaction between them. The next day, she found a mending basket tucked under the washstand. It was filled with his work shirts, worn thin at the elbows, and socks riddled with holes. She sat by the fire, her needle flashing in the light, and began to repair them. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. Stitch by stitch, she felt like she was mending something inside herself as well. Eli watched her from the corner of his eye as he cleaned his rifle. He recognized the nightshirt she wore. It had been Sarah's. Seeing this strange, broken woman sitting in his wife's chair, wearing his wife's clothes, mending his shirts, sent a pang of something sharp and uncomfortable through him. It was a feeling he could not name, a mix of resentment and a deeper, more unsettling ache. He had kept his wife's things in a chest, a private shrine to his grief. He had only given the nightshirt to Clara out of necessity, but now her presence was seeping into the cracks of his life, disturbing the dust of his carefully preserved sorrow. Days bled into a week. Clara grew stronger. The color returned to her cheeks, and the haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a deep, abiding weariness. She discovered a small flock of chickens in a coop behind the cabin and took over the task of feeding them and collecting the eggs. The simple routine grounded her. The chickens did not judge her. The cold morning air was clean. These small things became her anchor in a world that had been tilted off its axis. One afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats and the jingle of a harness broke the quiet. 2 riders were approaching the cabin. Clara froze, her hand flying to her throat. "It's just the Whitakers," Eli said, his voice flat. "Neighbors." He went to the door as a man and a woman dismounted from a sleigh. The man, Josiah Whitaker, was thin and stooped, with a nervous, apologetic air about him. His wife, Mildred, was the opposite. She was a stout, formidable woman with sharp, bird-like eyes that missed nothing and judged everything. "Eli," Josiah said, stamping his feet. "Just checking to see you weathered the storm all right. Figured you might be low on supplies." "I'm fine, Josiah," Eli replied, his body blocking most of the doorway. Mildred, however, was already peering past him. Her gaze landed on Clara, who stood frozen by the hearth. Mildred's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Clara from head to toe, taking in the borrowed nightshirt, the bruised face that was just beginning to fade, the bare feet. It was a look of instant, uncharitable appraisal. "Well now," Mildred said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It seems you've had company." Eli's jaw tightened. He stepped aside, a gesture of reluctant hospitality. "This is Clara. The storm caught her out on the road." Josiah shuffled his feet, looking embarrassed. We heard in town a woman had run off from Jebediah's place." Mildred's smile was thin and sharp. "So, this is the one. Heard she was crazy. Heard she was a thief." She looked directly at Clara, her voice like a probe. "Is that your locket, girl? Jebediah is telling everyone you stole it from his dead mother." Clara flinched as if struck. The locket. It was still clutched in her hand, hidden in a fold of the blanket. It was not his mother's. It had been a gift from Daniel, her first husband, the only thing of beauty she had ever truly owned. "She stole nothing," Eli said, his voice low and hard as granite. "She was near frozen to death on my fence line. That's all you need to know." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mildred Whitaker was not deterred. She saw a story here, a scandal to be carried back to town like a prized scalp. A reclusive widower and a runaway wife, trapped together by a snowstorm. The story would write itself. "Well," she sniffed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "People will talk. Eli, taking in a woman of her reputation, it doesn't look right." "I don't much care what people say." "Mildred," Eli said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And I don't much care for you saying it in my house." Josiah cleared his throat nervously. "We should be going. Millie, long ride back." He nodded at Eli, his eyes refusing to meet Clara's. "Glad you're all right, Eli." They left, and the silence they left behind was heavier than before. The outside world had intruded, bringing its poison with it. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trembling. Crazy. Thief. A woman of her reputation. The words were stones, and she could feel their weight piling up on her chest, threatening to crush her. She retreated back into her memories, back to a time before the whispers and the bruises. She remembered Daniel, her first husband, a miner with hands stained by coal, but a laugh that was clean and bright. They had lived in a small shack in a mining camp, poor as church mice, but their home had been filled with a gentle warmth. He had given her the locket for her 19th birthday, saving for months to afford it. He had fastened it around her neck and told her she was his treasure. A year later, the mountain had taken him. The timber supports in the shaft had given way, and Daniel, along with 5 other men, was buried under 1,000 tons of rock and earth. Destitute and alone, she had drifted, taking work as a laundress, a seamstress, whatever she could find. That was when she met Jebediah. He was a rancher with a bit of land and a reputation for hard drinking. He had offered her marriage, a roof over her head. At the time, it had seemed like a rescue. She had been so hungry, so tired of being alone. She learned quickly that she had only traded one kind of prison for another. Jebediah did not want a wife. He wanted a possession, someone to cook his meals, warm his bed, and absorb the violent rage that boiled up in him whenever the whiskey took hold. He had stripped her of her name, her dignity, her very sense of self, until all that was left was a creature who knew only fear. The night she ran, he had tried to take the locket, calling it a whore's trinket. She had fought for it, the one last piece of the woman she used to be, and that fight had given her the strength to flee. Eli watched the storm of memories play across her face. He saw the flicker of pain, the shadow of remembered terror, and in it, he saw an echo of his own loss. He looked at the empty space beside him, a space that had been occupied by his wife. Sarah. She had been the light in this cabin, her laughter echoing off the log walls. She was full of life, of plans for a garden, for the child she carried. He had built this cabin for her, for their future, and he had lost her in it. The memory was burned into him like a brand. The long, agonizing labor, the midwife's grim face, Sarah's weakening cries. He had stood by, helpless, useless, as the life had drained out of her and their stillborn son. The silence after her last breath was the loudest thing he had ever heard. In the years since, he had replayed it 1,000 times, wondering what he could have done differently. Should he have taken her to the doctor in town sooner? Should he have built the cabin closer to help? The guilt was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he could never take off. He had failed her. He had failed to protect his family, and so he had locked himself away, convinced that love and connection only ever led to ruin. One evening, a few days after the Whitakers' visit, the fragile peace between them was shattered. Eli was working in the small lean-to that served as his forge, trying to reset a shoe on Gideon's front hoof. The horse was restless, and the light was failing. He heated the iron in the coals, the metal glowing a malevolent orange. He brought it to the anvil, his hammer ringing out in the cold. Still air, but the metal was stubborn. He could not get the shape right. He plunged it back into the fire, his frustration mounting. This simple task felt monumental. It was another thing he could not fix. He could not fix his past, could not fix the silence in his cabin, could not fix the haunted look in the eyes of the woman he had taken in. And now he could not even fix a simple horseshoe. He pulled the glowing metal out again, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. With a roar of pure, helpless frustration, he brought the hammer down, not on the shoe, but on the horn of the anvil itself. The resulting clang was deafening, a violent explosion of sound that ripped through the quiet evening. It was not a sound directed at anyone but himself, at his own inadequacy. Clara had been bringing him a cup of coffee. She was only a few feet away when the hammer fell. The sound, the sudden, violent rage in his posture, the raw fury on his face. It was Jebediah. For one blinding, terrifying second, the quiet, scarred rancher was gone, and in his place stood the monster she had escaped. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the frozen ground. A small, terrified cry escaped her lips. She turned and fled, not looking back, her bare feet stumbling over the uneven ground. She ran for the only refuge she could think of, the barn. Eli stood frozen, the hammer still in his hand, the echo of the clang ringing in his ears. He saw the shattered mug, the dark splash of coffee on the snow. He saw the terror in her eyes just before she turned, and he understood. The self-directed anger, the violence of the sound. She had not seen it for what it was. She had seen it as a threat, a prelude to a beating. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him hollowed out with a sudden, sickening self-loathing. He had frightened her. He, who had done nothing but offer her a quiet, safe space, had become the thing she feared most. He let the hammer drop to the ground. He stood for a long time in the growing dark, the cold seeping into him. Then, with heavy steps, he walked toward the barn. He found her in an empty stall, huddled in a pile of straw, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from a terror that went bone deep. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way her head was bowed. He stopped at the entrance to the stall. Words were useless things. What could he say? I wasn't angry at you, it was just a horseshoe. The words were cheap and meaningless in the face of her terror. He knew that. So he said nothing. He walked slowly into the stall, his boots sinking into the soft hay. He did not approach her directly. Instead, he sat down on the straw a few feet away, his back against the rough wooden planks, facing the same direction as her. He just sat. He did not look at her. He did not speak. He simply shared the space, a silent, steady presence in the shadows. He breathed in the scent of hay and horse and cold earth and waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The barn grew darker. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the horses in their stalls and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He waited for her to run, to scream, to shrink further away from him. But she did none of those things. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her trembling began to subside. The rigid lines of her body softened. She was still afraid, but his quiet, non-threatening presence was a balm, an anchor. He was not shouting. He was not advancing. He was just there. Finally, she lifted her head. She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he let her see past the grim, stoic mask. He let her see the regret, the shame, the apology he could not speak. A long, shuddering breath escaped her. She turned her head away, looking out into the darkness of the barn. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was not empty or awkward. It was full. It was a bridge being built across a chasm of fear and pain. After a long while, she spoke, her voice a thread of sound in the vast quiet of the barn. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not ask what she was thanking him for saving her from the storm, for the food, or for this, for understanding that silence could be the kindest apology of all. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn movement in the dark, a single word, a single gesture, but in the broken, silent world they shared, it was enough. A seed of trust, fragile and tentative, had found a place to take root. The world began to weep. For weeks, the snow had held the land in a silent, white embrace. But now, under a strengthening sun, it surrendered. The thaw came not as a gentle melt, but as a great sigh of release. Water dripped from the cabin eaves in a steady, rhythmic patter, a sound of life returning. It trickled in rivulets down the window pane, blurring the sharp edges of the landscape. The prairie, which had been a vast, unforgiving sheet of white, began to show its bones again. Patches of dun-colored grass, the dark, damp soil, the silver green of stubborn sagebrush. The air, once sharp and sterile, grew heavy with the rich, loamy scent of awakening earth. Clara felt the shift inside herself as well. The deep, physical aches began to fade. The cuts on her feet had scabbed over and were slowly healing into pale white lines. The ugly bruise on her cheek had yellowed and vanished, leaving no visible trace of Jebediah's hand. She was eating regularly, and the hollows in her face had begun to soften. But the healing was only skin deep. At night, in the small, dark space of the cot Eli had moved to the other side of the cabin for her, the ghosts came. Sleep was a treacherous country, populated by the shadows of her past. She would wake with a strangled gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of stale whiskey sharp in her nostrils and the echo of a bellowing voice in her ears. She would lie awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the man across the room, a sound that was slowly becoming her only anchor in the night. Eli knew about the nightmares. He would hear the small, sharp intake of her breath that signaled her waking, and he would lie on his own cot, perfectly still, pretending to be asleep. He did not know what to do, what to say. Comfort was a language he had forgotten how to speak, so he offered what he could, the silent continuation of their routine, the unspoken promise of safety within the four walls of his cabin. One bright, clear morning, when the ground had firmed up enough to walk on without sinking into mud, Eli led his horse, Gideon, from the barn. He was a handsome buckskin, intelligent and steady. Clara watched from the doorway as Eli spoke to the animal, his voice a low, gentle murmur she rarely heard him use with people. "It's time you learned to ride properly," he said, not looking at her. It was not a question. A person can't live out here without knowing how to sit a horse. You can't run forever on your own 2 feet. The words struck her. He was not just teaching her a skill. He was offering her a means of escape, a way to be free. And yet, fear coiled in her stomach. The last time she had ridden a horse, Jebediah had been behind her, his hands gripping her waist like a vice, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her neck as he laughed at her fear. The animal had been an extension of his will, another creature to be dominated. "He's gentle," Eli said, sensing her hesitation. "He's got more sense than most men I know." He showed her how to approach, how to hold out a hand and let the horse nuzzle her palm. Gideon's muzzle was soft, his breath warm. Clara's hand trembled as she stroked the horse's neck. Eli's hands were over hers for a moment as he adjusted her grip on the reins, his touch calloused and brief. Yet it sent a jolt through her that was not entirely fear. "Just trust him," Eli said, "and trust yourself." Getting into the saddle felt like climbing a mountain. Her body was stiff with terror. She expected the horse to bolt, to throw her to the unforgiving ground. But Gideon stood perfectly still, patient as stone. Eli held the bridle, his steady presence a silent reassurance. "He's got you," Eli said. "Just breathe." She did. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her knuckles white on the saddle horn. And then she was on. The world looked different from this new height, vaster, more open. Eli led the horse in a slow circle around the yard. With every step, a knot of fear inside Clara loosened. The horse's gait was smooth, powerful, a rhythm of life beneath her. She was not being controlled. She was being carried. After a few minutes, Eli released the bridle. "He's yours now," he said, stepping back. She hesitated, then gently nudged Gideon's flanks with her heels. The horse moved forward, into a slow, easy walk. She was riding, on her own. A small, wobbly smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile she had felt in years. She looked over at Eli. He was leaning against the fence post, his arms crossed over his chest. There was a look on his face she had never seen before, a quiet, unguarded pride that softened the harsh lines around his eyes. In that moment, he was not just her rescuer, he was her teacher, and she felt a flicker of something warm and unfamiliar take root in her chest. A week later, the road to Jericho was finally clear. Their supplies were running low. Eli announced he was riding into town, his tone making it clear he expected her to come with him. "You need proper shoes," he said, his gaze falling to her feet, which she had been wrapping in strips of cloth, "and fabric for a dress." Panic seized her. "I can stay here. I do not mind." "No," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are not a prisoner here. Clara, it is time you walked in the sun." The town felt different than she remembered. Or perhaps she was different. Before, she had scurried through it with her head down, trying to be invisible. Now, sitting beside Eli on the wagon seat, she felt exposed, a spectacle. The whispers started the moment they arrived. As they walked toward the general store, she could feel the eyes on her back. Conversations would stop as they passed, only to resume in hushed, urgent tones once they were out of earshot. She saw Mildred Whitaker standing with a group of women, and the look Mildred gave her was one of pure, venomous satisfaction. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. Silas Croft, the proprietor, was civil enough to Eli, but he barely acknowledged Clara's existence as she stood by a bolt of simple brown calico. She heard two women talking in the next aisle. "That's her," one whispered. "The one staying out at the Hartman place. My Henry saw her, said she's got him wrapped around her little finger." "Shameless is what it is," the other replied. "Living in sin with that man, and him a widower. Some say she's cursed, that she brings ruin to any man who takes her in. First her husband in the mine, then Jebediah driven to drink and ruin, and now she's latched onto poor Eli Hartman." The words were like wasps, stinging and cruel. Clara felt the color drain from her face. She was not just a runaway. She was a plague, a curse, a scarlet woman. She wanted to shrink back into the shadows, to disappear. But then she felt a presence beside her. It was Eli. He had heard. He said nothing to the women. He simply stood beside Clara, his presence a silent, solid shield. He picked up the bolt of brown fabric. "Is this the one you want?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, as if they were the only two people in the store. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As they were leaving, a man blocked their path. He was tall and severe, dressed in black, with a face that seemed perpetually disappointed in the world. It was Reverend Miller, the town's spiritual shepherd. "Brother Hartman," the preacher said, his voice sonorous and heavy with piety. He pointedly ignored Clara. "A word, if I may." Eli stopped, his expression hardening. "I'm listening, Reverend." "I am a man who cares for the souls of his flock," the preacher began, his eyes sanctimonious. "And I must confess my concern. The town is alive with talk about this woman. To shelter a sinner is one thing. To invite scandal into your home is another. You are a good man, Eli, a man who has known suffering, but continuing down this path will ruin your name. You must send her away, for your own good, for the good of the community." Clara felt a wave of shame so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. He was right. She was ruining this man who had only shown her kindness. Eli looked at the preacher, his winter sky eyes cold and flat. He was silent for a long moment, the air crackling between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Reverend," he said, "have you ever been hungry? Not the kind of hungry where you miss a meal, but the kind that gnaws at your insides until you would eat dirt to make it stop." The preacher looked taken aback. "Well, Have you ever been afraid?" Eli continued, his voice relentless. "So afraid that your own heartbeat sounds like a drum calling you to your grave. So afraid that you'd rather face a blizzard than the four walls of your own home." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over the preacher. "You talk of sin and my name. This woman's only sin was wanting to live. Until you have known that kind of hunger or that kind of fear, you have no right to speak to me of what is good." Without another word, Eli took Clara's arm gently and guided her past the stunned reverend, leaving him standing in the middle of the street like a black-clad monument to his own hypocrisy. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Clara sat beside Eli, the new leather of her shoes stiff and unfamiliar, the bolt of fabric a weight on her lap. The preacher's words echoed in her mind. "Ruin your name? Send her away." She looked at Eli's profile, at the hard line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes staring at the road ahead. He was a good man, a quiet, decent man, and she was a stain on his life, a blight he had brought in from the cold. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, she found her resolve. He was cleaning a rifle by the firelight, the rhythmic slide and click of the mechanism, the only sound in the cabin. "Mr. Hartman," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He stopped his work and looked at her. "I want to thank you for everything you have done for me, for the food, the shelter, for your kindness." He watched her, his expression unreadable. "The snow is gone now," she continued, forcing the words out. "The roads are clear. I will be leaving in the morning. I cannot bring any more shame to your door. You have suffered enough on my account." Eli set the rifle down carefully. He stared into the fire for a long time, so long that she thought he had not heard her. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were dark with an emotion she could not decipher. "You are not a prisoner here, Clara," he said, his voice low. "You never have been. If you want to leave, the road is open. You are free to go." Her heart sank. It was what she had expected, what she had known he must say, and yet it hurt. He held her gaze. "But you are also free to stay," he added, his voice quiet but firm. "As long as you want. This is your home. If you choose it, the talk in town means nothing to me. The choice is yours." Tears welled in her eyes. He was giving her back a piece of herself she thought had been destroyed forever. A choice. He was not casting her out. He was not holding her captive. He was simply opening a door and letting her decide whether to walk through it. She could not speak. She only nodded. A wave of gratitude and relief washing over her that was so powerful it left her weak. Later that night, the sky broke open. A different kind of storm rolled in from the west, a spring thunderstorm full of sound and fury. Thunder rattled the very logs of the cabin, and lightning bleached the world white for a split second, followed by an immediate, suffocating darkness. The storm outside mirrored the storm in Clara's mind. The crashing thunder became the sound of a door being kicked in. The flash of lightning was the glint in a pair of furious, drunken eyes. She was back in Jebediah's house, trapped, cornered. She cried out in her sleep, a small, whimpering sound at first, then a full-throated scream of pure, animal terror. She sat bolt upright on her cot, thrashing, her hands batting at shadows only she could see. The dream still had its claws in her. The cabin door flew open, slamming against the inside wall. Eli stood there, a silhouette against the storm-lit doorway, his rifle in his hand. He had been outside, checking on the horses, seeing her state. He set the rifle down and was across the room in 2 long strides. "Clara," he said, his voice sharp with alarm. She did not see him. She saw a large male form lunging at her out of the darkness. A raw, guttural cry was torn from her throat. "No! Get away from me!" She scrambled off the cot, trying to get away, but her legs tangled in the blanket and she fell. He was there, kneeling, reaching for her. She flinched, throwing her arms up to shield her face. She was trapped. It was happening again. "Please," she sobbed, the word a desperate, broken prayer. "Please, not again." His hands closed gently on her arms. He did not shake her. He did not restrain her. He simply held her, his grip firm but not confining, an anchor against the violent tide of her fear. "Clara," he said again, his voice softer this time, closer. "It's me. It's Eli. You're safe. You're here. With me." His voice cut through the fog of her terror. Eli. The name registered. She stopped struggling, her body going limp, racked with great, shuddering sobs. The nightmare receded, leaving behind the cold, shaking reality. She was on the floor of the cabin, and Eli was holding her, instinctively, desperately. She clung to him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, her fingers digging into his back. She held on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to tear itself apart. He held her without speaking, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. He could feel the violent trembling of her body, the frantic, terrified beat of her heart against his own chest. He held her and rocked her gently, like a frightened child. And as he held her, a tremor ran through his own body. It was the tremor of a man who had walled off his own heart, who had forgotten the feel of another human being in his arms, who was suddenly overwhelmed by the raw, shattering depth of her pain. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, and in that stark, momentary light, their eyes met. He saw the sheer terror in hers, the reflection of unspeakable horrors, and she saw something in his eyes that stopped her breath. It was not pity, it was pain, a deep, profound sorrow that mirrored her own. She saw his loneliness, his grief, his own haunted past reflected back at her. In that single, silent moment, they ceased to be rescuer and victim. They were simply two people, stripped bare by the night, their scars visible to each other in the firelight. Something shifted between them, a tectonic plate deep in the landscape of their souls. The ground had changed. He held her for a long time, until her sobs subsided into quiet, ragged breaths, until the trembling finally ceased. He did not let go. He did not move away. He simply stayed, a warm, solid presence in the stormy darkness, and there, held safely in his arms, with the thunder rumbling harmlessly in the distance. Clara closed her eyes. For the first time since she had fled into the cold Wyoming night, she slept a deep and dreamless sleep. Spring did not arrive in Wyoming. It waged a quiet war against the stubborn grip of winter. It came first in the sound of the creek behind the cabin, its voice changing from a muffled gurgle beneath the ice to a full-throated roar as it threw off its frozen shackles. It came in the scent of wet soil, a smell so rich and potent it felt like the very breath of the land returning to its body. Patches of determined green appeared on the south-facing slopes, and the skeletal branches of the cottonwood trees along the water began to swell with the promise of leaves. On the ranch, new life announced itself with the bleating of lambs and the bawling of knock-kneed calves, their mothers nudging them with a fierce, primal tenderness. The change in seasons mirrored the quiet transformation within the cabin's log walls. The space between Clara and Eli, once a chasm of awkwardness and fear, had become a comfortable silence. The night of the thunderstorm had broken something open in both of them, and in its place, a new, unspoken understanding had settled. They moved around each other with an easy, practiced rhythm, a domestic ballet choreographed by the demands of the ranch. He no longer felt the need to fill the quiet with clipped commands, and she no longer felt the need to make herself small and invisible. The silence was no longer empty. It was a shared territory, a place of peace. They had fallen into a routine that was both demanding and comforting. Before dawn, Eli would rise to see to the livestock while Clara coaxed the fire back to life and started the coffee. They would eat breakfast together, the scrape of their spoons against the tin bowls a familiar sound in the growing light. They worked through the long days, their tasks intertwining. While he mended a broken fence line, she would be in the small patch of land he'd tilled for a garden, her hands in the cool, dark earth, planting seeds for vegetables that would feed them in the months to come. She had taken the fabric he bought her and, with a needle and thread, fashioned a simple, sturdy dress of brown calico. Wearing it, she felt less like a ghost haunting his home and more like a woman who belonged there. One morning, the handle of the old tin kettle she was using to pour boiling water broke off, sending a cascade of scalding water splashing harmlessly onto the hearthstones. Clara let out a small yelp of surprise. Eli, who was cleaning a saddle by the door, looked up, his face immediately taut with concern. He saw the broken handle in her hand, the overturned kettle, and the steam rising from the stones. He saw she was unharmed, and then a slow, wry smile touched the corners of his mouth. "That kettle was old when my father built this place," he said, his voice laced with a strange, rusty amusement. Clara looked at the pathetic handle in her hand, then at the kettle lying on its side like a vanquished soldier. A bubble of something light and unfamiliar rose in her chest. It was laughter. It came out as a soft, breathy sound. Hesitant at first, as if her body had forgotten how, Eli's smile widened, and he let out a low chuckle, a sound so unexpected it seemed to startle him as much as it did her. They stood there for a moment, two solitary people sharing a small, ridiculous moment of breakage, and the sound of their combined, quiet laughter was a more profound sign of spring than any thawing river. With the roads clear, Eli began taking her to town with him on his weekly supply runs. He did not ask if she wanted to go. He simply hitched the wagon and waited for her, a silent expectation that she was now a part of his world, both on the ranch and off it. The whispers and stares of the townsfolk had not ceased. If anything, their continued presence together only fueled the gossip. Clara learned to endure it, drawing strength from the solid, unbothered man walking beside her. He moved through the town's judgment as if it were nothing more than a mild breeze, his focus on his list, his business, and the woman at his side. He was ignoring their scorn, and by his example, she was slowly learning to do the same. She held her head a little higher, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to let them see how their sharp, righteous eyes still felt like stones against her skin. Their fragile peace was destined to be broken. One Saturday, the main street of Jericho was busier than usual. They were in the general store, Eli negotiating the price of seed corn with Silas Croft while Clara gathered a few necessities. As she reached for a spool of thread, a shadow fell over her. "Well, look what we have here," a voice sneered, thick with malice. Clara froze, the spool of thread slipping from her fingers. She knew that voice. It was the same coarse timber as Jebediah's, but pitched higher, meaner. She turned slowly. Caleb, Jebediah's younger brother, stood before her. He was a leaner, hungrier version of her husband, with the same cruel mouth and small, close-set eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value nothing. "Playing house with the town mute, are we?" Caleb said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. Conversations faltered. Everyone turned to watch. "My brother takes you in, gives you a roof and his name, and you repay him by running off like a thief in the night." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the blood drain from her face. She wanted to run, to hide, but her feet felt nailed to the floorboards. Caleb's eyes narrowed, fixing on the simple silver locket at her throat, which she had begun to wear openly again. "And wearing my mother's locket, bold as you please. You're a deserter and a thief, and you'll answer for it." A tremor started in her hands, a violent, familiar shaking. But then she felt Eli's presence at her side. He had moved so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. He did not look at Caleb, He looked only at Clara, his expression calm, grounding her. His nearness was a fortress. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met Caleb's hateful gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, but it did not break. "This locket was a gift from my first husband," she said, her hand rising to cover it protectively. "It was never your mother's." Caleb let out a harsh laugh. "A likely story. Jebediah wants you back. He's a forgiving man, but he wants his property returned first." His eyes raked over her, insulting and possessive. Eli took a single step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Clara. He still did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply looked at Caleb, and the cold, flat stillness in his eyes was more menacing than any shouted curse. "This conversation is over," Eli said, his voice low and final. "Get out of our way." Caleb hesitated, his bravado faltering for a second under the weight of Eli's gaze. He was not a man accustomed to being challenged by quiet. He took a half step back, his face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "This is not over," he snarled, pointing a finger at Clara. "You'll pay for what you did, both of you. I swear it." He turned and stormed out of the store, shoving past a customer in his haste. An uncomfortable silence descended. Everyone was staring, their faces a mixture of fear, pity, and morbid curiosity. Eli ignored them all. He bent down, picked up the spool of thread Clara had dropped, and placed it gently in her trembling hand. "Let's go home," he said softly. The ride back to the ranch was steeped in a heavy silence. The confrontation had ripped a hole in the peaceful world they had been building, letting the ugliness of the past rush in. Back in the cabin, the setting sun cast long shadows across the floor. They moved through the evening chores, the silence between them now strained, filled with the things that had been said and the things that had been left unsaid. Later, they sat by the fire, the flames the only light in the darkening room. Clara stared into the dancing light, seeing Caleb's face in the embers. The fear and shame were a cold weight in her stomach. Eli finally broke the silence. His voice was rough, hesitant. "I was married once," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Her name was Sarah." Clara turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden confidence. He never spoke of his past. She was full of life," he continued, the words coming slowly, as if he were pulling them from a great depth. "She died in this cabin, in childbirth, the baby, a boy. He died with her." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was here. I watched it happen, and I could do nothing. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed. After that, I did not want to feel anything again. It was easier to be alone, to not care about anyone or anything. If you do not care, you cannot lose." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded pain. "When I found you, I almost left you there in the snow, because I was afraid. I was afraid of bringing life back into this house, only to watch it be taken away again. I am still afraid. Clara." It was a confession that laid his soul bare. He was not just a quiet, scarred man. He was a man terrified of his own heart, haunted by a love he had been powerless to save. Clara felt a wave of empathy so profound it ached. His pain was not so different from her own. They were both just trying to survive the wreckage of their pasts. She moved from her chair, kneeling on the rug beside him. She did not touch him. She simply brought herself closer, into the circle of his grief. "Pain makes us human, Eli," she said, her voice soft and sure. "It does not make us evil, and being afraid does not make you weak. It only means you have something worth losing." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw not a victim to be pitied, but a woman of incredible strength, a woman who had walked through her own hell and emerged with her spirit. Though battered, still intact. She understood. She was not afraid of his scars, because she had her own. A quiet, profound intimacy blossomed in the space between them. There was no confession of love, no kiss. None was needed. The truth of what was growing between them was present in the way his gaze softened when he looked at her, in the way she no longer flinched when he moved suddenly. It was in the long, lingering looks they shared across the dinner table, in the comfortable weight of their shared silence. They began to work as a true partnership, moving as one to meet the relentless demands of the ranch. Spring was a time of endless labor. They mended the last of the winter-damaged fences, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same tool. They worked in the garden together, their heads bent low over the dark soil, their shoulders nearly touching. One afternoon, while they were branding the new calves, a young steer broke free. Without a word, they moved to corner it, anticipating each other's movements. A silent, seamless dance of two people who had learned to read each other's minds. They were not just a man and a woman living under the same roof. They were a team. This quiet, hopeful chapter of their lives lasted for nearly a month. The garden sprouted, the calves grew strong, and the memory of Caleb's threat began to fade. Like a bad dream in the morning light, they had built a fragile sanctuary, a world of two against the harshness of the plains. The world intruded on a Tuesday. They were sitting on the porch steps in the late afternoon, enjoying a rare moment of rest, when a rider appeared on the horizon. It was not a neighbor. He was a young, uniformed man, a deputy from Jericho. He rode with an official purpose that made the hair on Clara's arms stand on end. He dismounted, his face grim and businesslike, and handed Eli a folded piece of paper. "This is for the woman, Clara," the deputy said, avoiding her eyes. "From Sheriff Brody." Eli's face was grim as he took the letter. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the neat, official script. Clara watched his expression, saw the muscles in his jaw clench, saw the cold, hard light come back into his eyes. He did not show her the letter. He did not need to. "What is it?" she whispered, though she already knew. "It's from your husband," Eli said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "Jebediah. He's filed a formal complaint. He's accused you of theft. The locket!" He crumpled the paper in his fist. "The sheriff has issued a warrant. He's coming to arrest you tomorrow morning." The crumpled letter in Eli's fist was a death sentence for the fragile peace they had built. The air in the cabin grew thin, heavy with the unspoken dread of the coming morning. For a long time, neither of them moved. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the room filled with the deep blue of twilight. But Eli made no move to light a lamp. They sat in the growing darkness, the silence a living thing between them, vast and cold. Finally, Eli rose. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that was more unnerving than any outburst of anger. He went to the pegs above the door and took down his rifle. He did not check if it was loaded. It was always loaded. He simply held it, his hand resting on the cool, worn stock. Then he walked to the hearth and began methodically cleaning the weapon. The soft, oiled clicks of the mechanism the only sound in the suffocating quiet. Clara watched him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She knew what this meant. He was not going to let the sheriff simply take her. He was preparing for a fight for her. "No," she whispered, the word a ragged tear in the silence. He did not look up from his work. "The sheriff will be here at dawn. We will ride out to meet him." "No," she said again, her voice stronger this time. She stood up and went to him, her hands clenched at her sides. "Eli, you cannot do this." "It is already done," he said, his voice flat and hard. "He will not take you." "And what then?" she cried, her voice rising with a frantic energy. "You will fight him? Fight the law. They will call you an outlaw. They will hunt you. They will take this ranch. Everything you have worked for, everything your father built, they will destroy you. For me." The last words were a choked sob. "I am not worth that. I am not worth your ruin." He finally stopped his work and looked up at her. His face was a mask of stone in the dim light, but his eyes held a fire she had never seen before. "Let them," he said, his voice low and guttural. "Let them take the ranch. Let them take my name. It is all just dirt and dust and silence. It is nothing." Tears streamed down her face. She shook her head, her whole body trembling. "I will not let you. I will not be the curse the town says I am. I would rather go with the sheriff. I would rather be in a jail cell than see you lose everything. I am more afraid of losing you than I am of losing my freedom." She was begging him, pleading with him to save himself from her, from the trouble she had brought to his door. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, afraid to touch him, afraid to break the fragile, intense stillness between them. He looked at her, at the raw terror and selfless love in her eyes. The hard mask of his face seemed to crack, to soften. He reached out and covered her trembling hand with his own, his grip firm and warm. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He was silent for a moment, searching for the right words, for a truth solid enough to anchor them in this storm. "Before you came here, this house was not a home. It was a tomb. I was not living. I was just waiting. For nothing. I did not speak unless I had to. I did not feel unless I had to. The silence was so loud it was all I could hear." He looked from her face to their joined hands, then back again. "You broke that silence. You brought life back into these rooms. You made me feel something other than grief." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "You have already saved me from silence. Letting them take you now would be the same as letting them send me back to it. I will not go back." His words were not a declaration of love in the way a poet might write it, but for a man like Eli, a man made of earth and sorrow, they were more profound. He was not fighting for her out of a sense of duty or honor. He was fighting for the life she had given back to him. She looked at him, her tears still falling, but now they were tears of a different kind. She saw the truth of his words in the depths of his winter sky eyes. They were in this together. There was no other way. She nodded slowly, sealing their pact without a word. They rode out at first light, not waiting for the sheriff to come to them. The sky was a pale, pearly gray, the air cool and damp with dew. They rode side by side on the wagon, Eli's rifle resting across his lap, his face set and grim. Clara sat beside him, her back straight, her hands clutching her silver locket. They were not running. They were riding to face a judgment they knew would be unjust. Jericho was already awake when they arrived. Word had spread like wildfire. The hearing was to be held in the sheriff's office, but the small room could not contain the morbid curiosity of the town. People spilled out onto the boardwalk, their faces a sea of judgment. Clara saw Mildred Whitaker, her arms crossed, a look of vindicated satisfaction on her face. She saw Silas Croft, the store owner, peering out from his doorway. She felt their whispers like a physical touch, a cold, slimy caress. Sheriff Brody met them at the door. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble. He looked at the rifle in Eli's lap and sighed. "There will be no need for that. Eli," he said, his voice tired. "This is a hearing, not a war. Leave it with the wagon." Eli hesitated, his jaw tight. Then he gave a curt nod and laid the rifle under the seat. He helped Clara down from the wagon, his hand on her elbow, a small, protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by the crowd. The sheriff's office was small and stuffy, smelling of stale cigar smoke and dust. A makeshift courtroom had been arranged, with the sheriff's desk serving as the judge's bench. Caleb stood to one side, a smug, confident sneer on his face. Beside him, dressed in his funereal black, was Reverend Miller. The hearing began. It was a farce of justice. Sheriff Brody was a decent man, but he was bound by the words of others. Caleb was the first to speak. He stood before the desk, his voice ringing with false sincerity as he wove a tale of deceit and betrayal. "My brother, Jebediah, is a good, hard-working man," Caleb began, his eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd. He took this woman in when she was a destitute widow. He gave her his name, his protection, a roof over her head. And how did she repay his Christian charity? She was thankless, sullen. She drove him to drink with her moods. And then, one night, she stole a precious family heirloom, a silver locket that belonged to my sainted mother, and ran off, deserting the husband she had sworn before God to honor. He played his part perfectly, painting a picture of a wronged husband and a wicked, scheming wife. The story fit neatly with the gossip the town had already embraced. Clara could feel the weight of their belief pressing down on her, suffocating her. Reverend Miller was called next. He spoke not of facts, but of morality, his voice booming in the small room. "A wife's duty is to her husband," he declared, his gaze falling on Clara like a physical condemnation. "To flee that sacred bond is a sin against God and man. This woman chose a path of darkness when she left her home. Mr. Hartman," he said, turning to Eli, "in his misguided compassion, has given shelter to this sin, allowing it to fester. I pray for both their souls." The room murmured in agreement. The case seemed closed. Sheriff Brody looked troubled. He turned to Eli. "Mr. Hartman, do you have anything to say in this woman's defense?" Eli rose. He did not look at the preacher or at Caleb. He looked at the sheriff, and then he looked at the faces of the townsfolk who had known him his entire life. "I am not a man for speeches," he began, his voice low and steady. "I only know what I saw. I did not find a thief on my property. I found a woman half dead from cold and exhaustion. She was barefoot. Her dress was torn. Her lip was split open." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I have seen the look of terror in her eyes when a man raises his voice. I have seen the bruises that were on her skin when I found her. Those are not the marks of a deceitful woman. They are the marks of a hunted animal." He turned his gaze to Clara, and his voice softened. "Since that day, I have seen her get up every morning and work until her hands are raw. I have seen her face, your whispers and your judgment with a quiet dignity you could all learn from. I have seen a woman who was broken to pieces begin to put herself back together. That is the truth of what I have seen." A silence fell over the room. Eli's words were simple, stark, and powerful. They held the unadorned ring of truth. Sheriff Brody rubbed his weary eyes. "It is a difficult situation," he said slowly. "We have one man's word against another's. Mr. Hartman, your testimony speaks to her character, but it does not disprove the charge of theft. There is no proof, either way." He looked at Clara, his expression a mixture of duty and pity. "Without proof." He let the sentence hang in the air. The choice was clear. She would be sent back to Jebediah, to the man who had laid the complaint, the man who had beaten her. In that moment, something inside Clara shifted. She had been a passive figure in her own life for so long, a victim of circumstance, of men, of fate. She looked at Eli, standing tall and alone for her, risking everything. She looked at the smug face of Caleb and the cold, righteous face of the preacher, and she realized that she was tired of being silent. She was tired of being afraid. Trembling, she stood up. All eyes turned to her. "Sheriff," she said, her voice a fragile thread of sound, "may I speak?" Brody nodded. "Go ahead, ma'am." She walked to the front of the room. Standing before the sheriff's desk, she felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She took a deep breath. "My name is Clara," she began, her voice gaining a small measure of strength. "Before I was Jebediah's wife, I was Daniel's wife. He was a miner. He was a good man. He gave me this locket." She held it up, the silver catching the light. "He died in a cave-in. After he was gone, I had nothing. I married Jebediah because I was hungry and I was alone. I thought it was a kindness." Her voice broke for a moment, and she paused, swallowing hard. "It was not a kindness. My life in that house was not a life. The bruises Mr. Hartman spoke of, they were real. Every time his temper flared, every time the whiskey took hold, he would— She could not say the words. She did not have to. Instead, she turned slightly, her back to the sheriff, and with a trembling hand, she unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her dress at the back of her neck. She pulled the collar of the brown calico down, exposing the pale skin of her shoulder and the top of her back. There, stark against her skin, was a faded, ugly scar, a jagged line a few inches long. "He threw a skillet once," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It missed my head. This is where it hit." A collective gasp went through the room. The silence was absolute, profound. The town's idle gossip had just been confronted with the brutal, physical evidence of its source. It was no longer a story. It was a scar. She fastened her dress, her fingers clumsy, and turned back to face the sheriff. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her gaze was steady. She looked past the sheriff, past the silent crowd, and her eyes found Eli's. His face was a mask of anguish, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he watched her, his heart breaking for the pain she had been forced to reveal, and swelling with a fierce, powerful pride for the courage it had taken. She gave a small, shuddering sigh and looked back at Sheriff Brody. "I did not run away because I am a thief," she whispered, her voice so quiet the room had to strain to hear it. "I ran away because I just wanted to live." The simple, devastating truth of her words hung in the air. It was a plea, a confession, and a verdict, all in one. Sheriff Brody stared at her for a long moment, his face etched with a deep sorrow. He banged his hand on the desk, the sound making everyone jump. "Complaint dismissed," he said, his voice a low growl. He glared at Caleb. "There is no theft here. Get out of my office. And you can tell your brother that if I ever hear of him laying a hand on anyone again, I will personally see him rotting in a federal prison." Caleb's face went from smug triumph to disbelief, then to pure, unadulterated rage. His face was mottled red and white. He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "You will regret this," he spat, his voice thick with hate. "This is not over." He turned and stormed out of the office, shoving people out of his way. The spell was broken. The crowd began to murmur, to shuffle out, their faces a mixture of shame, shock, and pity. They would not meet Clara's eyes. She stood frozen, the wave of relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical blow. Her legs gave way, and Eli was there in an instant, his strong arm around her waist, holding her up. He led her out of the office, through the parting sea of townspeople, and back to the wagon. The ride home was a blur. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and rose. The world was beautiful, but Clara could not see it. She sat numbly on the wagon seat, staring straight ahead, the entire ordeal replaying in her mind. The adrenaline that had carried her through had vanished, leaving behind a raw, hollowed-out emptiness. They were halfway back to the ranch when the first sob broke free. It was a ragged, tearing sound. Then another followed, and another, until her entire body was shaking with the force of her weeping. It was a storm of grief, not for the hearing, but for everything that had come before it, for her lost husband, her lost innocence, the years of terror, the spirit that had been so cruelly crushed. Eli immediately pulled the wagon to a halt. He did not speak. He simply looped the reins around the brake handle, stepped down from the wagon, and walked around to her side. He reached up and gently, carefully, lifted her down from the seat. He held her as she broke down, his arms a safe, solid harbor in the storm. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled against the rough fabric of his shirt. He stood there in the middle of the empty road, under the vast, open sky, and held her, stroking her hair, his own face a mask of love and pain. The sun bled across the horizon, its fading light bathing them in a soft, golden glow. Her sobs slowly subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths. She did not pull away. She leaned against him, her body exhausted, her spirit scoured clean. She tilted her head back to look at him, her face tear-stained, her eyes clear. "Do not let go," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words were not about his arms around her. They were a plea, a promise, a question about their future, all in one. He looked down at her, his rugged face softened by the dying light. He tightened his embrace, pulling her even closer. A silent, unwavering answer. He did not. The heat of a full Wyoming summer settled over the plains. A thick, shimmering blanket that baked the soil and bleached the grasses to the color of old bone. The days were long and silent, marked only by the drone of insects and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast, cerulean sky. But on Eli Hartman's ranch, it was a season of quiet abundance. The garden Clara had planted now overflowed with beans, squash, and corn, its vibrant green a testament to her patient hands. The spring calves had grown strong and fat, and the chickens clucked contentedly in the shade of the cottonwoods. The ranch was thriving, not just surviving, and it was because of her. Clara was no longer the haunted refugee who had collapsed on his fence line. She was the heart of the place, her quiet strength a steadying force. She moved with a newfound confidence, her opinions on the running of the ranch as valued as Eli's. They were partners in every sense of the word, their lives woven together by the threads of shared work, comfortable silence, and a love that had never needed to be spoken aloud to be deeply understood. The nights were their own, spent on the small porch, watching the stars ignite in the black velvet sky. The space between them filled not with words, but with a profound and peaceful intimacy. They had built a life, a small, fragile fortress of peace against the memory of a harsh world. One moonless night in August, they sat on the porch steps, the air still warm from the day's sun. A sense of deep contentment had settled over them. Suddenly, Gideon, safe in his stall, let out a sharp, panicked whinny from the barn. It was a sound of pure terror. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his head cocked, listening. At the same moment, a faint, acrid smell reached them on the breeze, the smell of smoke, but not from their chimney. Then they saw it, a flicker of unnatural orange light against the side of the barn, dancing and growing with a terrifying speed. "Fire," Eli breathed, the word a curse. He did not hesitate. He sprinted toward the barn, grabbing a bucket from the well as he ran. Clara was right behind him, her heart seizing with a cold, sickening dread. By the time they reached it, the entire south wall was engulfed in flames, the dry old timber of the barn catching like tinder. The fire roared, a hungry, living beast, its heat so intense it drove them back. The terrified screams of the horses trapped inside were a sound from hell itself. Through the churning smoke and billowing flames near the entrance, Clara saw a figure, a man, scrambling away into the darkness, his silhouette briefly illuminated by the inferno he had created. It was Caleb. The final, venomous promise he had made in town had been delivered. "The horses!" Eli yelled, his face grim in the hellish light. Gideon was in there. The other two mares were in there. He would not let them burn. Before Clara could scream a warning, he plunged the bucket into the water trough, threw the meager amount of water uselessly against the wall of fire, and then charged into the burning structure. "Eli!" Clara screamed, her voice lost in the roar. She stood frozen for a second, paralyzed by a terror greater than any she had ever known. Then, a strength she did not know she possessed surged through her. She was not the same woman who had fled from Jebediah. She would not stand by and watch the world burn again. She grabbed another bucket, her mind racing. It was useless against the blaze, but she had to do something. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the searing heat. She could hear the splintering crash of wood inside, the continued, frantic screams of the animals. An eternity passed. Then, one of the mares, its coat singed and its eyes rolling with terror, burst from the smoke and galloped madly out into the night. But there was no sign of Eli, or of Gideon. "Eli!" she screamed again, her voice raw with smoke and panic. Just then, a great groaning sound came from within the barn, followed by a deafening crash as a massive roof beam, consumed by fire, collapsed into the heart of the inferno. The entire structure seemed to shudder. That was it. He was gone. A wave of despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole washed over Clara. But then, through a momentary gap in the thick, black smoke, she saw him. He was on the ground, struggling to rise, a dark gash on his forehead. Gideon lay beside him, a heavy, smoldering beam pinning the horse's hindquarters. Eli was trying to heave the beam off the animal, his movements sluggish, his lungs clearly full of smoke. He was going to die in there. Clara did not think. She acted. She tied a wet rag from the trough around her face and ran into the fire. The heat was a physical blow, stealing her breath, searing her skin. Smoke billowed around her, thick and choking, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Sparks rained down like angry fireflies, catching in her hair and on her dress. Through the blinding haze, she found him. He was dazed, coughing, still trying to free his horse. "Eli, we have to go!" she shrieked, grabbing his arm. "Gideon," he choked out, his voice a hoarse rasp. She looked at the horse. Its eyes were wide with pain, and she knew, with a terrible certainty, that it was too late for him. "We have to go now," she screamed, pulling at him with all her might. He finally seemed to understand. He staggered to his feet, leaning heavily on her. As they turned, a section of the burning roof above them gave way, crashing down in a shower of embers and flame, blocking their path. They were trapped. Clara looked around frantically, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. She saw a small section of the back wall where the flames had not yet taken complete hold. It was their only chance. She half-dragged, half-carried Eli toward it, his dead weight almost too much for her. They smashed through the weakened planks, tumbling out into the night air just as the rest of the roof collapsed with a sound like the world ending. They lay on the ground, gasping, choking, their bodies trembling. The barn was a roaring funeral pyre, a monument to one man's hate. Clara pushed herself up, her hands screaming with pain. She looked down and saw the skin was red and blistered, burned from where she had pushed against a smoldering plank. But Eli was alive. He was breathing. That was all that mattered. As her vision cleared, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was Caleb, a heavy piece of wood clutched in his hand like a club, his face a demonic mask of triumph and rage in the firelight. "I told you I would finish it," he snarled, advancing on them. "He was supposed to burn with your precious ranch. Now I will just have to do it myself." He lunged at Clara. She scrambled backward, but she was exhausted, wounded. Eli was still on the ground, struggling to get his bearings, the head wound making him clumsy. Caleb raised the club. This was the end. After everything, after all the running, the fighting, the healing, she was going to die here, in the ashes of the life she had just begun to build. But as Caleb brought the club down, Eli moved. With a guttural roar that seemed to come from the very core of his being, he surged to his feet. He was wounded, swaying, but his eyes were clear and full of a cold, deadly fury. He met Caleb's charge not with a weapon, but with his own body. He threw a single, desperate punch, all of his remaining strength, all of his rage and terror for Clara. Behind it, the blow connected with the side of Caleb's head with a sickening crack. Caleb's eyes went wide with surprise. The club fell from his grasp. He staggered back a step, then another, a look of profound shock on his face. He touched his head, his hand coming away with blood. Without another word, he turned and fled, melting back into the darkness from which he had come. Eli stood swaying for a moment. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground. Clara crawled to him, her own pain forgotten. He was alive. They were both alive. And in the distance, the barn that had been their sanctuary, their project, their symbol of a rebuilt life, burned itself down to the ground. News came from the sheriff a few days later. Caleb had been found dead on the trail back to his brother's ranch. He had fallen from his horse, the blow from Eli having been more severe than either of them had realized. There would be no trial. It was ruled a matter of self-defense. But the news settled like another shroud over the blackened ruins of the barn. In the weeks that followed, a heavy silence returned to the ranch. It was not the comfortable silence of before, but one thick with grief and guilt. Clara tended to Eli's head wound, and he tended to the burns on her hands, which were slow to heal. The skin puckered and scarred, but the deeper wounds were the ones no one could see. Clara could not look at the charred remains of the barn without feeling a wave of crushing guilt. All this destruction, this death, had followed her here. She had been the lightning rod for the storm. One evening, as she was changing the dressing on her hands, the tears she had been holding back began to fall. "He is dead because of me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Gideon is dead. The barn is gone. I am a curse. Eli, I bring ruin." Eli stopped her, his rough fingers closing gently around her wrist. He made her look at him, his gaze intense, unwavering. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "Caleb did not die because of you. He died because of his own hate. Gideon and the barn were not lost because of you. They were lost because of his evil." He took her scarred hands in his own, holding them with an infinite tenderness. "Do not ever think that. No one dies because of your kindness. Nothing good is ever destroyed because of love." His words were a balm, a truth so powerful it began to push back against the lies she had told herself for years. He would not let her carry this burden. They would carry it together. Time passed. Summer bled into the golden hues of autumn. The physical scars began to fade. Clara's hands, though permanently marked, regained their strength. The gash on Eli's head healed, leaving another thin, white line on his already weathered face. Together, they began the slow, arduous process of burying the past. They salvaged what they could from the fire, but most of it was just ash and charcoal. With a grim determination, they cleared the debris, hauling away the scorched timbers, scraping the blackened earth clean. It was a funeral for the life that had been, and a groundbreaking for the one that would be. They were burying the ghosts of Caleb, of Jebediah, of a life of fear. And then they began to rebuild, log by log, nail by nail. They raised a new barn from the ashes of the old. The work was hard, their bodies aching at the end of each day. But it was a good ache. It was the ache of creation, not destruction. And as the new structure took shape, so did their future. One morning, just as the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern sky a soft, pearly pink, Clara woke. She reached for Eli, but his side of the bed was empty. She rose and went to the window. She saw him out by the new barn, the frame of it a proud, strong silhouette against the rising sun. He was fixing a section of fence, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a gentle, steady sound in the quiet air. The early morning light caught on his broad shoulders, making him seem like a figure carved from the land itself. She did not bother with shoes. She slipped out the cabin door, the dew-soaked grass cool and soft beneath her bare feet. She walked toward him, her heart full of a feeling so vast and calm it felt like the sky itself. He must have heard her approach, because he stopped his work and turned. He did not smile, but his eyes, when they met hers, said everything. They held the memory of the fire, the sorrow of their losses, the quiet strength of their survival, and a deep, unwavering love that was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She looked at his face, at the new scar and the old, at the kindness in his eyes, And she thought of everything they had endured, of all the pain and loss that had almost torn them apart. A tremor of fear, a shadow of the past, touched her heart. The fear of losing this hard-won peace, this incredible, quiet man. "Please," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Not again." It was not a plea against a nightmare's touch. It was a prayer against the cruelty of fate, against the possibility of more pain, more loss, more separation. Eli understood. He reached out and took her hands in his. He held them gently, his calloused thumbs stroking the puckered, scarred skin on her palms without flinching, accepting them, honoring them for what they had done. He looked into her eyes and answered her prayer, his voice a low, unbreakable vow. Never again. He drew her in, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. They stood together by the frame of their new barn as the sun rose higher, bathing the plains in a clean, golden light. A cool prairie wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the scent of sage and damp earth. It swirled around them, lifting the last of the ashes from the ground, carrying away the old ghosts on its current, leaving behind only the sound of two hearts beating as one, and the promise of life, resilient and relentless, returning to the land. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.